Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Mesopotamia in the first millennia before Christ in our continuing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. I want to talk a bit about the Assyrians. The early Assyrian period goes from 2000 to 1200 BC. That's a period that saw, at least toward the end of that, saw the Kassites in Babylon. We saw the Mitanni period where they come to prominence and then have their fall, first at the hands of the Egyptians, but then later on it's the Hittites. And then in 1200 BC, everything changes because we have that great series of migrations that just upset the entire ancient world. That introduces a period of the Dark Ages. Like we said, it begins in 1200 BC. It's also after this that we see the Assyrians beginning to use a new form of warfare, that is a cavalry. The idea of riding horses is something that seemingly had been borrowed by the Scythians to the north. They were a great nomadic group of horse riders, and the Assyrians saw, gee, that worked for them, it can work for us as well. And so they adopt those tactics as well during this period. I refer to it as the Dark Ages because civilizations seem to be in decline during this period. Now that's going to be followed by what we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 900 to 626 BC. We'll see Assyrian expansion. They'll come into the Levant. They'll eventually go all the way to Egypt. But then we will see the fall of Nineveh, and when it happens very quickly over a period of just a handful of years, and by 612 BC, Nineveh will be destroyed and will cease to exist. We can go there today, and there are just ruins there. And so we'll see Assyrian decline in the face of attacks from all fronts. Now, when we speak of the Assyrians, first of all, we want to note that they are a literary people, and they're not exclusive in that, but we have discovered vast libraries. So we have a great deal of written records, not just records of buying and selling like we might have among the Minoans or even the Hittites, but writings of fiction, of religion, of all sorts of areas. They were a literary people. They also kept wonderful records. In fact, we have a series of king lists. They are known as eponym lists. What happened is the Assyrians would name each year, instead of calling it 2014, 2015, and so on like that. They would refer to it as the year of so-and-so. They would name it after someone. And then they would also record special events that had to have happened that year. And included in those special events, they recorded solar eclipses. And that helps us to nail down the Assyrian chronology right to the year. It's a wonderful tool that they have left us. The Assyrians are known for their military machine that was developed earlier in their history. I put here a picture of, and this is from one of their wall frescoes, their wall paintings. They depict slingers. When we have David going against Goliath, sometimes we think, gee, David only had his little sling. But we have to remember that the sling was considered sort of a form of light, I guess I can call it light artillery, light weapons. Maybe not as advanced as swords and spears and shields, but still, it was part of their military. They also had the chariot. By now, chariots were almost passé, and notice this chariot depicted here is quite a bit more solid, probably depicting the war chariot of the king. The Assyrians also had made themselves masters of siege warfare. Throughout the second millennia, we have giant walls being built around cities, and if an enemy came up, you would just enter your wall, close the gates, and hold off perhaps for years at a time, as long as you have enough food and water. The Assyrians were one group that changed that because they developed not just the art of surrounding and starving out a city, but they would be involved in actively bringing down the city walls, attacking the city gates. Here we see an image of them breaking through the walls of a city in order to capture it. Now, Nineveh early in its history, and the Assyrians early in their history, lived on the banks of the Tigris River and exercised their domain in the surrounding countryside, but they are going to grow. We'll see the first stage of that growth still in the early Assyrian period, where one of their kings reaches all the way to the Mediterranean, takes in the scope of Babylon. The kingdom of Mitanni comes under its sway, and carves out a decent-sized empire. It's around this time that we begin to see the use of Assyrian terror tactics. One of their kings writes, "I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar, some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and I cut off the limbs of the officers. Many captives from among them I burned with fire. From some I cut off their hands and their fingers. From others I cut off their noses, their ears. Of many I put out their eyes. Their young men and maidens I burned with fire." These sort of terror tactics were designed to demoralize the enemy with fear of the cruelty of the Assyrians in what was already a cruel world. Notice the image of the city on the right here with the skulls of the enemies, the heads of the enemies, just affixed throughout. And yet, it often had the opposite results. Knowing the torture and mutilation and death that they would face if they lost the battle, the Assyrians often, their enemies often, were ready to fight to the death rather than to submit. Here we see a picture of the Assyrians coming home with their trophies of heads. Now, in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, and his reign is going to be from 1116 to 1076 BC. This is still during that Dark Age period. He conquers most of Syria, Urartu, that's the lands to the north of Assyria, as well as Babylon. He takes tribute from Sidon and Byblos, and that's followed by a period of decline. That's going to be the story of the Assyrians, where there'll be a great king, and then after a while things won't be quite so great. And there'll be, an expansion followed by a decline, followed by another expansion. Shalmaneser III, that's the fellow in the background, not the handsome person up front, he fights Ahab, King Ahab of Israel, at Karkar. It's sort of a standoff. He doesn't necessarily lose big time, but he is pushed back. And he also lays siege to Damascus. And we have an image on the black obelisk of Jehu from Israel coming and paying tribute to him. Here's that image on the black obelisk. The one kneeling before the king is Jehu, king of Israel. Now, it's a bit after this, during the days of Jeroboam II, that we have the story of Jonah, who was sent to Nineveh as a prophet to Nineveh. Instead he gets, had sort of a submarine ride. He's trying to find his way to Tarshish. Why? Because he doesn't want to see the people of Nineveh believe. He does eventually go to Nineveh. Nineveh is spared. It's not destroyed at this time. And it's interesting that if you go to Nineveh today, the city is in ruins, but you can still find the mound of Jonah. And I'm not sure if Jonah was really buried there, but at least it's used to commemorate him, because Jonah has a wonderful impact upon this city. And in turn, this city, it might be said, has an impact, at least during that period, upon the nation of Israel. You see, the edict of the king, and this is recorded in Jonah, he's not named, but the Assyrian Empire during this period was in a state of decline. And the king who was in power was Adad-Nirari III. This might be the king that's described in Jonah chapter 3. He reigns from 810 to 782 BC. And his sons follow him. Three of his sons, these are actually three brothers in a row, each of whom reigns. And it's during this period that Assyria gradually gives up her foreign possessions, not before she has attacked the enemies of Israel and given Israel a period of peace and prosperity. Was this happenstance? Was this by design? We are not told. Now, this is followed by Tiglath-Pileser III. He also goes, even in the Bible, by the name of Pul, which seems to refer to a gardener. He ascends to the throne via assassination. Could it be that he's a gardener and he looks through the window and sees his opportunity, climbs through, and assassinates the king? We don't know how it takes place, but he sets up himself as the new king, and he is bribed by Ahaz of Judah to attack Aram. That story is told in 2 Kings chapter 16. And he begins the Assyrian policy of deportations, where they would not only attack a city, but when they had captured it, all of its inhabitants would be taken away into captivity, relocated to a separate part of the Assyrian Empire. And this is going to have drastic consequences for Israel. He is followed by Shalmaneser V. It's during this time that Hoshea of Israel enters into an alliance with Egypt, and Shalmaneser V comes and besieges Samaria for 3 years. Now, right at the end, just as Samaria is about to fall, Shalmaneser V dies. But he's replaced by his brother, Sargon II. Remember, we had Sargon the Great from a long time earlier. And he continues the siege of Samaria, and Samaria really falls under him. He takes credit for the entire thing. And he carries Israel off. The northern tribes of Israel are carried away into captivity, and this is a captivity from which they will not return, at least not as a united country. There will be those of the 10 tribes that eventually make their way back into the Promised Land. But we will no longer have those tribal designations for different parts of the land of Israel. Now, the brother of Sargon comes to the throne after his death, and this is Sennacherib. The northern kingdom of Israel has already ceased to exist, but he's now going to come against the southern kingdom of Judah, and he besieges Jerusalem. After having captured a number of cities of Judah, he besieges Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. Do you remember the story of how he comes up against Jerusalem, and Hezekiah goes to the Lord and says, "Lord, do something," and sure enough, the Lord kills 185,000 of the Assyrians. And Sennacherib writes about it in a document called the Taylor Prism that tells the story of how Sennacherib went and captured all these cities and killed this king and killed that king. And when it comes to Hezekiah, he shut him up like a bird in a cage. And that's as much as he can say, because Hezekiah is still living and breathing. Well, Sennacherib goes home and he's assassinated. This is recorded both in the Bible as well as in Assyrian texts. And he has his fall. The next king we want to talk about is Esarhaddon. He comes up against Judah. He imprisons King Manasseh, the king of Judah. And then he goes on and he invades the land of Egypt. We're not sure exactly how far he goes, but takes all of northern Egypt and even marches southward, trying to take Thebes as well. By the mid-600s, the Assyrian Empire has grown to be the largest empire the world at this point has ever seen, stretching from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Nile. And yet, it would not long last. Ashurbanipal, the king of the height of Assyria's empire, known as the Scholar King. He has a collection, his library of more than 6,000 cuneiform texts, and yet it's in his day that we have prophets such as Zephaniah and Nahum that are prophesying against Nineveh. Zephaniah speaks about how the Lord will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. He will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness, and that will soon take place. It begins with a coalition of the Babylonians and the Medes. The Babylonians, or properly speaking, we ought to call them the Chaldeans, even though the capital is at Babylon. Nabopolassar of Babylon enters into an alliance with Sennacherib the Mede it's a marriage through alliance, where the son of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, takes the daughter of Sennacherib as his royal wife, and this coalition attacks the Assyrians. Babylon, the Medes, and I suppose the Scythians also get into the act, although they're not allied with anyone. They're just doing their own thing. And the city of Nineveh falls in the year 612 BC, never to be rebuilt. You can go to Nineveh today. It is still a ruined city. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so from here, Nebuchadnezzar continues on to the west, mopping up operations, any that are left of the Assyrians. And the question is, who's going to rule the world? There's, meanwhile, a king in Egypt. Egypt has now been liberated, now that Nineveh has fallen. And a new king by the name of Necho II marches up to Carchemish to meet Nebuchadnezzar. And the outcome of that battle will tell us who's going to be the next world superpower, but we'll look at that next time.